Welcome to my review of Hagane for Super Nintendo. This is a lesser known game that I don't see mentioned too much. It seems like a pretty obscure game that didn't get a lot of distribution. I've heard different theories on how this game was distributed, that it was just a rental at Blockbuster and wasn't available for purchase, but I've also heard some contradicting theories about it, so I don't really know the true history of the game, but I know that it's a pretty rare game currently, so it seems like it didn't get a lot of distribution. But it's a pretty good game, definitely one worth covering, you know what I mean? I thought it would be a good one to review. I completed the game on normal a few years ago. It reminded me initially a lot of the Super Shinobi series, Revenge of Shinobi and Shinobi 3, you know, the visuals and some of the weapons and things are very similar. But the game actually plays quite differently. When you play the game, it feels very different than any of the Revenge of Shinobi or Shinobi 3 or any of those games. But it does have some similarities. It has some fast-paced, gameplay with a lot of platforming and, combat that you really need to memorize the areas and know what's coming up to do well. Because you can only take a few hits before you die. You do have unlimited continues, though, so you will start at the beginning of the stage if you lose all your lives. And you can earn some 1-ups. As you can see, it's a mix of platforming and combat. And you have about 3 or 4 different weapons you can switch between. And they all have different uses for different scenarios, so it's actually cool because it gets you to switch up your weapons for different situations. You have bombs, you have throwing stars, you have a chain type of weapon, and you have your regular sword. And they all have different uses. So you'll find different strategies on bosses that you may have not realized you could have, exploited because you weren't using a specific weapon. A lot of times you can still win if you don't use, the optimal weapon for a boss. But you may figure out later, that there was a better way to play the boss, better weapons. So it gives the game some extra depth. You have a nice variety of different stages. Like in this stage, or this section, you have to basically just try to blaze through this area. And it's mainly a memorization type area. It wasn't one of my favorite type of areas because it's pretty heavily memorization based. You can easily fall in the pits and die and have to restart the section. Now the game has gotten a lot of hype for being extremely difficult, but I would say that hype really isn't warranted. I think that the game is a difficult game, definitely a challenging game, but I wouldn't consider it a brutally difficult game. But of course, this is going to vary from player to player. It depends what kind of games you're accustomed to. But I can say that I've, completed much more difficult games even on the Super Nintendo, like Super Smash TV, Gym Power, and, many more. But this game definitely, is definitely one of the challenging games. I mean, it's a challenging game. But if you practice it with save and load states, you can master the sections, and it's really not too bad. The main difficulty for me with the game was there is a pretty sloppy control aspect of the game, and it really comes down to what I would call edge jumping. Whenever you're on an edge or a ledge, and you try to jump, you have a very high chance of falling off the ledge if you get too close to the edge of it. And it sounds like something that, would normally happen in a game, like if you get too close to a ledge, but it happens very easily in this game. And it was probably the biggest negative for me in this game because the game requires you to do a lot of platforming where you really need to have precise platforming control. And, the fact that whenever you get near an edge or a ledge, you can very easily just kind of get sucked off the ledge almost magnetically. It doesn't feel like it's because you walk too far. It just feels like you get sucked off the edges. So, because of that, I found that it made the game unnecessarily difficult. So that was one of my biggest issues with the game. I think if they would have tightened up that control aspect, the game would have just been a lot better just from that. But that said, I mean, there's still some very well-designed parts. A lot of great platforming mixed with combat. It's actually very cool. It's just that kind of a buzzkill when it doesn't operate the way I would expect it to. You know what I mean? Because, when you're used to these kind of games, you kind of know how it should handle. You know what I mean? And I always had to be extra cautious around any ledges or any edges of the platforms because, I'd easily fall off for No real clear reason. It's just like if I got a little bit too close, I would just get sucked off. So now that sounds worse than it is, but yeah. So I mean, that was my main issue with the game. Because the game really seems to exploit that by having a shitload of platforming sections, and especially the final boss tries to be real cheap with that, where you have to do very tight ledge jumping, and on top of that, there's always an enemy waiting to shoot you as soon as you land on the ledge to knock you off the ledge, and you have to move up the ledges very, very fast to keep up with the boss, or you get left behind, and basically you can't win. You might as well just commit suicide, because you'll get left too far behind to catch up with the boss. So the game kind of exploits that, and I don't have a problem with that. I like that kind of gameplay, but I don't like the fact that the controls are bad when it comes to the ledges. You know, the design of the sections themselves, it's actually pretty well designed, but the control really holds it back from, feeling the way it should, at least to me. My good friend, Cool Hand Mike, actually, he beat this game as well, and he had the same issue with the ledges. So, I wasn't the only one who noticed it. But that's really my main issue with the gameplay. Other than that, though, the game has a nice variety of different sections. All the bosses are pretty challenging. You have to learn all the different patterns. They usually have multiple patterns to learn. There's a nice variety of different gameplay styles. Like here, you're riding this vehicle as you fight enemies. It's almost like a shooter. It's pretty cool that they mixed it up with that. And you have levels that are more vertical platforming where you have to escape in a certain amount of time, or the screen will kind of crush you. So there's a variety of different types of scenarios. So it keeps things pretty varied, which I like. And one of my favorite features of the game is that you can switch between the 4 different weapons at any time. So you can constantly be switching weapons as enemies appear in different places and different things occur in the environment. So, you can really get really good at the game with switching weapons and, taking enemies out fast. Like, see, I switch to the bombs, then I switch back to the stars, then to the sword. You can really switch between the weapons quickly. There's also these power moves. There's a power move where you do a bunch of cartwheels or some shit, and I have seen people use it in videos, but I just couldn't find a use for it, I mean, remember, I was just looking to beat the game and play it normally just to complete it. So I wasn't trying to do any kind of speed running or anything too flashy. I was just trying to beat it. I would find whatever was effective for my play style, and that's what I would do in the game, I never replayed it to try to do it faster or anything, just a one-time playthrough for me. And actually, I did come to really appreciate the game. I liked it. And I'm going to showcase, some of the variety. You can see 1-ups sometimes pop out of the enemy, so sometimes you can get 1-ups and shit from the enemies. And whenever you lose a life, you'll start on the last checkpoint you got to, so it's at least forgiving in that sense. But if you lose all your lives, you will have to start from the beginning of the stage, and the stages can be fairly long. The game as a whole is not overly long. But yeah, the environments are very detailed, great visuals, the music is very good. It's not on the level of Revenge of Shinobi, which I like to compare this game to, because it does have a similar look, but it actually plays quite different than those games. So it's not the best comparison, but it is a similar, side-scrolling action type of game in that sense. Some of the bosses are human-sized like you, and they're fast, so you really have to learn them. And those are cool fights. And then you have boss fights that are much larger. You have a nice variety of different types of bosses. You have levels like this where you're riding the minecart briefly, and then you'll switch back to being on foot again and fighting enemies that way. And there's a lot of climbing and platforming. And, I wish that I could be more positive about that aspect of the game, because, I do really like that kind of shit. But the problem is the edges, you know what I mean? But there are some really cool... The control around the edges is just, pretty shitty. That's the one thing that... it is something you'll learn to adapt to. But it made me always have to be extra cautious around edges, when normally I could do that kind of shit pretty effortlessly, because I'm used to that in games, but I had to be extra careful in this game. And that would kind of slow me down around the edges, just being that extra bit cautious. But you will get used to it. But, for the last stage, I didn't really want to deal with that shit, and I came up with my own strategy, which I'll show the final boss fight, and I'll show how I beat it. And I'll explain, because that was a workaround that I found to work around the platforming on the final boss. But yeah, so here you got another boss fight, just showing some of the bosses. And there's a nice variety of bosses that perform in different ways, and the theme is really well done. It's kind of like a Japanese theme with futuristic elements and shit like that mixed in, supernatural. It's I like the visual style a lot. I think it looks great. And like I said, the music is very good. So the game really does have a lot going for it, aside from just the gameplay. But yeah, depending on depending on how difficult you like your games to be, will probably depend if you're going to appreciate this game. I don't want to give the impression that it's by any means an easy game. It can actually be quite difficult at times because of that. Because of that control, really can make it hard. At least for me, it made it a lot harder than it should have been. But this is definitely a tough game. I mean, it's much harder than games that are usually highly regarded for difficulty, like the Contra series on NES. To me, I always thought those were moderate games. Once I got to a certain skill level, I should say. When I was younger, they seemed extremely difficult. But this game is much harder than something like Contra for NES or Super Contra. It's way, way harder than those games. I mean, now those games, have limited continues, and this has unlimited continues, but this game is much harder, because even redoing a stage is much harder than most of what's in those games. So it's going to depend on your level of familiarity with these types of games. The mobility in the game is great, though. Like, you can see me doing this jump roll in midair to move across shit. It works really great, and you can kind of bounce off walls and jump on shit. There's a really good control in that aspect. Controls really nicely the way you can kind of fly through the air with these flips. It gives you this horizontal dash capability in midair, basically, when you flip like that. Some of the later stages have some irritations I didn't like they use the old idea of, the maze-type levels where you have to take the correct doors in the correct order. Never liked that shit. It was in the Shinobi games as well, and I never liked it, but it's in a lot of games. For me, that's a weakness in the game. I don't like that kind of shit, personally. I mean, you will memorize the order of doors to take, obviously, but your first time playing it, you're going to be going in loops a lot because you're not going to know, where you're supposed to go. For the most part, the game is extremely linear. There's maybe only one or two parts where you can kind of get lost. There's a cave level, too, that I didn't really like. That was a little bit too slow-paced. And you had to tediously take out all these enemies and move slowly. And, you would take a wrong dead end and have to go back and try to find the other area in the cave of where to go. I didn't like that underground area either. And I didn't really like the door shit in the last level where, you can take the wrong doors and get sent back. So these are some aspects of that with the edge jumping. There's some things that I didn't like about the game, definitely, that did take away from it for me. But I did learn the game. I used save and load states, and I was able to learn the game. And, obviously, once I knew the order of doors to take, I didn't get stuck on those parts anymore. But I just think it's kind of unnecessary. I'd rather just have a straightforward progression through the levels. Not really into mazes and shit like that. Now, these levels can be tough where you have to traverse vertically through some of these areas while the screen scrolls up, and you don't have a lot of time to do it. Now, here's the spikes scroll up is what it is in this part, yeah. And this part, it can be tough because the edge jumping is so sensitive. You can easily fall off the edges, and then you fall back down again. It can be very irritating. So, like I said, I really do like the design of this. I like this kind of challenge and this kind of platforming a lot. I just don't like the way it's executed in this game overall because of the sloppy edge jumping. And I think once you play the game, you'll start to see what I'm talking about. But if you are skilled at these kind of games, you will adapt to it. But, even once I was able to play and beat the game, it left a bad taste in my mouth as far as, I always thought I would have liked the game much better if it would have just played better with that, you know what I mean? And I didn't have to, fucking babysit the edges all the time. I always have to be, overly aware of each little edge that I get to the end of. Otherwise I would try to move a lot faster. But see, it's easy to fall down because it's sloppier than it looks when you get to those ledges. So yeah, if I didn't make that point clear, I think now you get the idea. But even with all that, you can see there's some nice gameplay here. I mean, there's a cool kind of flow to the levels. And they can be very fast-paced. I don't really like the stages as much where you have to wait around for shit and slowly take out large enemies and then move really slow. like the cave where you're getting lost and you got to take out these really like large enemies that take long to kill. They're not hard, but they just take long to kill and slow you down. So there's parts like that where I felt like the pacing could have been a lot better if they would have kept the same fast pace throughout the entire game. But there's only a few slow moments like that in the entire game. Most of it is pretty fast paced and pretty well done with a nice variety. You know, the bosses, they have different areas you have to hit. They have a lot of different patterns, usually not just one or two moves. They usually have several different moves. So, I mean, they're not super complex boss patterns by any means. But, you know, I mean, you could say that about most games of this time period, you know. Once you knew the few moves that the bosses would do, you could, you know, predict it and deal with it pretty well. Same thing here. But yeah, the boss fights are on par with, you know, most of the better games of this time period. And I'm going to say that the game, you know, oh yeah, now this is the final boss. I'll show you my strategy here. See, you have to jump on these ledges very, very quickly, and these guys will shoot you off as soon as you fucking land on the ledge. So what I did was I saved up pretty much all my bombs by not using them in the final stage much at all, and I saved a shit ton of bombs. And then what I do is I jump up while using my bombs to clear out the area for me so I can keep moving up. If you don't do this, it's much, much harder to do. But this was my style that I came up with. And works very well for me. And I was able to take out the final boss very fast. Otherwise, it's a very long fight. And you saw I slashed at the final faces as well to finish them off. But otherwise, the fight can be very long and drawn out where you're constantly climbing and getting knocked down. And it's just overly fucking irritating because of that shitty ledge jumping. You know what I mean? It didn't have to be that way. It could have been a much tighter control. So, because of that, you know, I do have to knock the game down. And because of some of the slower paced sections and maze-like sections and things like that, it does take the game down for me. So, overall, I would give this game a 7.5 out of 10. And I would say that the rating is pretty much the same back then as it would be now because platform games haven't really evolved that much, 2D platformers, you know, compared to how they were back then. And today, I mean, Super Mario World is still one of my favorite platformers of all time, 2D platformers, and I mean, there's plenty of indie games that have tried to improve on that style of game, and you know, I still don't feel like they have to the point of making a better game than that. So, I think the 7.5 holds up, and I think it's a game worth checking out. Just be aware that it is going to be quite a challenging game, so be ready to practice specific parts and take some time to practice everything and put the whole game together. Luckily, you only have to do one stage at a time, but the stages are pretty long. So you will have to, you know, learn all the various sections in practice. Thanks for watching.